The political brouhaha over the role of benefits following Mick Philpott's conviction for killing his 6 children almost overshadowed what the judge called his history of physical, sexual and emotional abuse.
You stop!
But the patterns of behaviour were there to be seen even on national television. We'll ask how it is that abusers so often manage to stay hidden in plain sight. Good evening. In the wake of the sentencing of Mick Philpott for causing the deaths of 6 of Philpott's children, the news has been dominated by the intervention of the Chancellor, since backed by the Prime Minister, who said that the killer's lifestyle, paid for by benefits, raises questions about the welfare system. But the judge in the case, Mrs. Justice Thirlwall, was very keen to stress that it was necessary to lay out Philpott's history with other women before pronouncing sentence on him. She went on to set out a picture of a dangerous man who inflicted appalling physical and mental abuse on his wife and his lover and had done so to women previously. Zoe Conway reports.
Behind closed doors, more than 2 million people in the UK are suffering from domestic abuse. It's not just about violence. Mick Philpott didn't just assault his wife Mairead, he tried to own her and his mistress. The judge who sentenced him said, "You controlled and manipulated those women as you had controlled and manipulated their predecessors. These 2 young women were not even permitted to have a front door key. Women were your chattels. You bark orders and they obey."
And it's just, people need to be shocked with things like this, because this is what's going on your street.
Tomorrow. The Philpott case has brought back many painful memories for X Factor contestant Jermaine Douglas. He knows what it's like to live in a house full of fear. For years, his father subjected him, his mother and his siblings to violence and psychological abuse.
The control and the violence, for me, mingled together. The control was a massive part of everything, and that's the part that gets you more than the physical abuse, the emotional torture, and to know that you can't be anything because he's there. And a lot of people think, why didn't she get away from him? Why didn't she do this and do that? But the control just keeps you in that little bubble, and you can't escape that.
Last year, around 1.2 million women in England and Wales were affected by domestic abuse. Fewer than 1 in 4 people who experience abuse at the hand of their partner report it to the police. The most common form of abuse is non-sexual.
I just can't be thinking of school right now. I don't need the stress.
No, I just don't feel like it.
What? Don't you love me?
Domestic violence is not just to be found in adult relationships. The government, which produced this video, says the level of abuse in teenage relationships is worryingly high. In fact, young people may be more susceptible to abuse than any other age group. Just last month, the Home Office expanded its definition of domestic violence to include 16 and 17-year-olds who are in relationships. It also added to the definition coercive behaviour, which it said is an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation and intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish or frighten their victim.
He started to push me and pull me, and he started to hit me really, like burn me with lighters, and then it got on to like hitting, punching, slapping.
Last April, Newsnight met Taylor Douglas. She was 16 years old when her boyfriend abused her. She finally broke free 2 years ago.
Young men in general, I find, have a lack of respect for young women, and it's because of music and sort of the media and rappers, how they talk about slapping their women and stuff like that. I think that it encourages it.
It's not just the lack of good male role models that worries Taylor.
I see Rihanna with her partner Chris Brown being beaten and then getting back with him and showing that the world that that's acceptable. Obviously it's her own personal choice, but it doesn't really give off the right impression.
I mean, you can call her a mate after what she accused me of last week.
One of the most well-known stories of abuse involves Kirsty and Tyrone in Coronation Street. But she isn't the victim.
Bro, I'm not enough!
The plotline led to a huge increase in the number of men calling a helpline for male victims of abuse. In Britain last year, 800,000 men suffered as a result of domestic violence.
And then lied to me like the liar you are!
It's all very well raising the profile of domestic abuse, but can we afford to?
There is so much abuse and domestic violence that I think we are in a crisis. We've got massive cuts to public spending. We've got the withdrawal of funding to voluntary agencies that deal with this kind of violence, and yet we're being asked to do more and more to protect children and adults from harm.
The Philpott case brought the issue of persistent and controlling abuse out into the open this week. But will individuals, authorities and the justice system change as a result?
Zoe Conway. Well, Polly Neat is the Chief Executive of Women's Aid, a charity which campaigns to end domestic abuse and also works with victims. Carmel Napier is Chief Constable of Gwent Police and the lead officer for domestic violence at the Association of Chief Police Officers. And Anna Lark is a former partner of the comedian Justin Lee Collins, who was convicted last October of harassment causing fear of violence after he subjected her to a campaign of abuse during their relationship. First of all, Anna, the CPS figures suggest that women experience an average of 35 incidents of domestic violence before reporting the incident to the police. In the Philpott case, as far as we understand, these women don't go forward at all. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me at all. It's a really how can I put it? It's a very, very hard crime to pin down, really. It's because it's emotional abuse, you almost don't realise it's abuse. It's kind of, it starts
like
off...
what sort of things?
Well, it's drip-fed. At the beginning, everything's wonderful. You think you've met the man of your dreams. Everything's really lovely. And once they sort of... not have you, but once you know you're quite smitten, the control starts. In my situation, it was I had to change my phone number. I wasn't allowed to contact any people from my past, that we were going to have a nice future together, that my past should remain in the past. But he also made me sit down with him and he asked me about every single person I'd ever slept with or had been intimate with and wrote it down in a pad.
And it took you a while to realise that this actually was a form of abuse and this wasn't somehow your fault.
Yeah, I mean, what they do is they separate you, so you are in this little bubble, and you know, you think that it's your fault, you know, that everything's going wrong, and they say to you, you know, if you behave in a different way, if you do this and that, you know, then our relationship would be better, and it's always your fault. It's never theirs. It's very hard.
But eventually, you got a prosecution.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Polly, in the case of the Philpotts, let's be quite clear that Mrs. Justice Thirlwell wanted to lay out very clearly the whole abuse question on behalf of Mick Philpott, but he also said that Mairead Philpott, who we must remember was found guilty of the deaths of these 6 children as well, at one stage. Mrs. Justice Thirlwell said there were 3 occasions in which Philpott asked her for a divorce and she said no. So she did, when she had a chance, exert her authority on him.
I think it's very difficult. You can't put yourself in the mind and in the situation of Mairead Philpott, and I think it's impossible for me to do that. I think what's really clear, though, is that the kind of controlling behaviour that we're talking about really does take away the free will of victims. It reduces their self-esteem over a long period of time, and also reduces the choices that they feel are available to them. And a lot of the time, there's a very small window of opportunity that somebody could take in order to get out of that situation. They really would have to act very quickly and decisively.
Yeah,
and that's your experience?
Because they're so isolated from contact, both formal and informal, of other people, outside that household. So even if they're going to work, actually within that work environment, they're very limited. They're taking them to work, they're collecting them from work.
Well, and the Philpott's case, you know, they didn't have a key, they didn't, all the benefit and wages had to be handed straight over and so forth.
That's right. So that isolation means that they've got nowhere formal or informal to go, and hence the importance of people at work, neighbours, families, friends, police, social services, health service in particular, for someone who's having contact with doctors, maternity provision, etc., to be proactive and alert.
But does that make you powerless in many ways, in the sense if you don't have all these other agencies and these other people coming forward? It's very difficult sometimes for the police, is it? Not to take it seriously, but to act on it.
I think all agencies need to be alert and proactive and then work together so that all the jigsaws can be put together. So actually, you know, people are presenting differently from what would be a person who's living within a happy environment, and actually the circumstances would be different. And I think it's about that training and awareness, both within the wider public and families and friends, that will help address that.
But it's also the idea that if you do anything about it, it'll come back 10 times worse for you.
Exactly. There's death threats. You know, I'll put you in hospital. If you leave me, I'll put you in intensive care. I'll hurt the cat. There's all sorts of threats. I'll tell your parents about your past, and just all sorts of control and you're absolutely petrified. You're absolutely petrified, and you just lose your identity. It's almost it's a brainwashing, and it's really, really scary.
This wasn't the focus of the main reporting after the case, was it? I mean,
no, that's right. And I think it's really important that we understand, you know, the domestic violence dimension to this case and to other high-profile cases that happen, because the kind of thing that Carmel was talking about all agencies really being aware of and understanding the problem, and women themselves being able to name what they're experiencing as abuse, that's about a discourse and a cultural scenario around
and you heard
everybody.
the young people saying there, you know, that the whole nature of control, it's hard to work out that you're actually being controlled. And recently the change, of course, has been allowed that 16 and 17-year-olds should also be seen as victims of domestic abuse, but also the cumulative effect of coercion.
Yes.
And actually, a number of incidents can be taken together to prove psychological abuse, but this is not necessarily about criminal convictions.
No, it isn't, but it is about, really, the first thing the victim wants is the abuse to stop, and the support for the families. So actually we should worry less about criminal or not criminal or civil, but to work with the victim to actually ascertain the whole circumstances, what's happening in that relationship.
But is that part of the police's remit?
Yes, it is, to work with the other agencies and the victim to do that, and at the same time to look at the perpetrator. So there's been a lot of focus in domestic abuse historically, and this is where we're changing our working together to do victim and perpetrator at the same time, so that we know the detail of the perpetrator's history of relationship, not only with that individual but with others, and holistically investigate the incident which is attended, which the first for the police will be the 36th for the victim. And that's really important to remember.
To remember that. But also, we must also remember that we are talking not only about women in domestic abuse. I mean, the Coronation Street line that's been running on Tyrone, that there are many men who are also victims of abuse who also don't come forward.
I think that's right, and it is very difficult for any victim of abuse to come forward, but I also think it's important to remember that where you have a repeated pattern of abuse, almost 90% of the victims of repeated abuse are women, and that is an important thing to remember.
Do you think the police are still taking this seriously, or are trained to take this seriously enough?
I think at the top of the police and indeed the CPS, I think there is an absolute will to take this seriously. I think there's a real commitment. I think on the ground, at grassroots level, it is patchy, and police officers are part of society, and they're influenced by society's attitudes towards women, towards domestic abuse in general, and it's really important that they have training and awareness in order to break free of that.
You accept that actually at the ground level general, it's not so well recognised, it's not so well dealt with.
We've recognised that actually that is an area that we need to improve on, and as a result of that our focus has been working with heads of public protection in all the forces and chief officers to actually enhance the role of the specialist domestic abuse officers. So in my own force, for example, the frontline officers are trained, they do their responding emergency response in order to make the victim safe, do the risk assessment, which is so key, and then the specialist investigators on duty 24/7, looking not only at that incident but working with the victim, perpetrator, children, other agencies to do a holistic investigation of the whole incident.
The whole culture, I mean, MTV ads running now because this is abuse in front of your face when your phone's taken away and you don't even know it.
Exactly, yeah.
Young women are not fully appraised of their own rights,
absolutely.
Are they?
No. And we found recently that a fifth of 16 to 19-year-old girls don't understand being coerced into sexual acts, for example, as abuse. We really need to deal with this in the education system.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, I do agree. Yeah, there isn't, especially with this case, you know, how it's been turned into about benefits. I mean, it's just, the whole thing is a 30-year, this man has like had is 30 years of like domestic abuse.
And it must be presented somewhere, and when we will hear perhaps in the future if it presented. But on the question, because I know that Women's Aid were concerned about, in the reform to make sure that benefits are so-called simplified, there'll be a universal benefit which will be paid into an account which doesn't necessarily need to be the women's account in the house. And what the claim is, that will give women less freedom to be able to get out. They still get child benefit themselves, though.
There is a concern, though, that the welfare reforms will impact on refugees, and we need to be clear. Refugees are funded through the benefits that the women living in them receive. It's really important that we acknowledge that refugees are under threat and that they're a critical part of the support bit of that network that Karma was talking about locally. We must not let the network of refugees around the country fall apart. It's absolutely critical.
Thank you all very much indeed.